My name's Scott Hill. I'm the senior curator for the exhibition The People's House, the Sydney Opera House at 50, which opened 2.5 weeks ago down at the Museum of Sydney. What we're talking about today, just to revisit the theme, is in researching the upcoming exhibition, The People's House, curators explored an extraordinary number of posters and programs held in the State Archives. So what was the process for going through such a vast collection? And it's vast, and what were the challenges, and what were some of the hidden treasures were revealed. I'd like to, as well as we start, just recognize that I'm coming to you today from the land of the Cadigal of the Eora Nation, which is also where the Museum of Sydney and the Opera House stands. And just a caveat as well for any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are viewing, that the presentation does contain some images of deceased persons. And as it has become the standard joke for any of these presentations and for tours as we're doing, just as we start, if you could kindly turn off your wristwatch alarms and bleepers before the performance, so we don't have any disturbances. I tell this joke probably every second day, and it hasn't got tired yet. So the exhibition itself, it opened on the 1st of July, and we're going through till the 12th of November. So the period that covers the major events for the 50th anniversary for the Opera House in September and October this year. It takes place at the Museum of Sydney. We're down at the corner of Bridge and Phillip Street, so about a block up from Circular Quay. It's the site of the first government house, which is actually a really nice connection then between the Museum of Sydney and the Opera House itself, which stands on Tuba Gully, known to most people as Bennelong Point, named for the First Nations man Bennelong. And then at Government House is where a lot of the early interaction between Bennelong and Governor Phillip then took place. We are open every day from 10 till 5 p.m. and on Thursdays, we're having Thursdays up late like we did last night. Entry is free. Also, keep an eye out for an ongoing series of talks and programs that we have, including a very special event, an evening with Harold, commemorating Harold Blair, Australia's first professionally trained Aboriginal opera singer. And that's going to be held at the Sydney Opera House on the 18th of October. And just note, we're popping a couple of links into the chat. They should be there already, including the link, direct link to go and see the details for an evening with Harold, but they're very easy to find online if you just jump online. So when we're looking at the collection in the archives, because these really form the backbone of a lot of the exhibition when you go down to see it, there are thousands of posters in the New South Wales Archives collection. So how did they come to be there? They're ultimately from the Sydney Opera House's archive. And we also have material there from the Dennis Wolanski Library and Archives of the Performing Arts, which used to be at the Sydney Opera House from 1973 when it first opened through till 1996 when it was closed at the Opera House, and the collections were then dispersed amongst various institutions. So some of it came to the State Archives, some went to the various universities like the University of New South Wales, University of Sydney. Other material went to the Seaborn, Broughton and Walford Foundation, for instance. So all of that material, if you're curious about where that material has went and what it contained as well, that you can follow one of the links in the chat. The poster collection was largely the collection of the Sydney Opera House archive itself, not the Wolanski. It was named the Wolanski after Dennis Wolanski, who was a major benefactor to the Opera House in its opening years. And the Opera House's library and then the Archives of the Performing Arts. So material collected that related to the performing arts, because the investigation of the performing arts and their promotion and their research was part of the original Opera House's remit from the Act of Parliament that set it up. Just on the left-hand side, just to give you an idea of how many we're talking about, this is only a tiny selection of what our digital asset system looks like when you open it to see all the scanned posters that we're actually featuring in the exhibition. And already just looking there, you can see just the extraordinary variety, both of content, but of poster style. And we'll be coming back to that several times in this talk. where are they physically kept? So when you go to the State Archives, I really encourage you as well to go on a behind the scenes tour. They hold these, where there was one just recently with the big archives open day. But the actual storage areas are extraordinary, just corridors that go for miles back into the building. The Opera House posters in this case are stored in these massive plan cabinets, and the arrows there indicate all of the drawers that contain the posters. And there's anywhere from 30 to 128 posters per drawer in 25 drawers. So all up, we went through about 2,400 posters and a small number of programs when we were deciding on the content and the themes of the exhibition. This is my colleague, Dr. Jackie Newling, who I worked with very closely on this aspect of the exhibition. And here we are actually going through the posters. The staff from the reading room, I think we certainly taxed their patience, because we took over the reading room for several weeks. And posters are very large, so we had to take over several of their tables and all of their trolleys. To physically see these as well literally meant standing up on the small stool so we can look down and just taking photographs, for instance. So that's just a bit of the gymnastics that was required with going through the poster collection. But we were out there for several weeks. That's Edwin on the right-hand side. He's one of the archive staff who was a great help to us in going through this whole process. The programs, they're all stored in boxes instead. They're much smaller, and so they're stored in these archival boxes. And just a section on the left is part of the catalogued information regarding those. You can see just some of the ones that we've then highlighted as we've been going through. Just a note about these, though, you may have, for instance, a production listed on the left-hand side. In this case, the drama theatre, so they're all listed by their location. Over on the left, the box numbers, because certainly the key to operating and to researching the archives is to take very, very close attention of where something was when you came across it. So a tip, if you're ever working with material like this, when you're taking the photographs, take a photograph of the document as is, but then write all the information. So in this case, like the box number or what's called an NRS number, pop that on a piece of paper and sit it in the same photograph, and then take that photograph again. So you can never lose the information that relates to that particular image you've taken. That was a big help to us. That's a big tip I would give. When we look at this information, though, some of these locations on the left, like the drama theatre, is still there, but some other locations have changed. So the Opera Theatre is now the Joan Sutherland Theatre, for instance. But some of them have changed their name. Some people will know the name the Opera House Cinema. That doesn't exist anymore. We now call it the Playhouse. The exhibition hall doesn't exist at all. So there's been changes in the actual distribution of space inside the Opera House, and that's captured through the programs and the posters, and we've also reflected that in the exhibition. One thing I will point out is that in the exhibition, there is an emphasis when we come to the programs on that first year. So we didn't set out to do a year-by-year profile of the Opera House. It's certainly not a best of or one program per year approach to that. Instead, we looked at what were some of the major themes that we see over those full 50 years, how they're expressed in that first year, and we emphasized that. It's also a nod to what we're actually commemorating this year with the Opera House, which is 50 years since the great openings, both the gala opening and the official royal opening. We've been asked what were the criteria that we went through for choosing the posters, and this is actually part of that. This is one of our spreadsheets that we used. And you can see down the left, a whole list of the posters. And on the right, that's only some of the criteria that we went through for choosing. So we wanted to make sure that with our poster collection, that we reflected all the major companies. They're originally called the principal hirers, now we call them the resident companies, so that we adequately gave them a presence. Also that we reflected all the different locations for performance in the Opera House, and that's also outside, so all those external spaces as well. Also the sales, because that's now a site of performance. Also the kind of content, so what were the kinds of performances that were being done, and also the graphic style. So we were also looking at how this poster selection shows the evolution of graphic and poster style over the past 50 years. And you can see then that all the different dots reflect particular categories. And we did this so that we could then look at the poster selection and say, well, is there a big gap that's formed against some of these criteria? And then we could modify our selection according to that. This is the posters actually being installed in the poster room, as in Gallery 2 in the exhibition. So if you know the Museum of Sydney, Gallery 2 is our main exhibition space. The exhibition actually covers the entire top floor. It's one of the biggest exhibitions we've ever actually staged down at the Museum of Sydney. But this section here we've referred to as the poster room, and it's partly an evocation of every teenager's bedroom walls covered in posters, but also the idea of a studio hang, as it's called. Paintings that might be hung in a studio, one above the other. This is actually a photograph of the installation process underway and how these posters are actually supported. It's what's called a hinge mount, which is like a careful double hinged tape hang that happens underneath the top edge of all of those posters. So after we made the selection, they went through quite a rigorous conservation process just to make sure they were suitable for hanging, because these are not what you call mint condition posters in many cases. In some cases, they're posters that have actually been hung before. So they went through that whole process. Some had to be stabilized and reinforced in various ways. This is then that room finished, looking in both directions. And I think what you'll really see immediately is the extraordinary variety of content, but really you also notice all those different poster styles that you see from over those 50 years. It's been really gratifying to notice people coming in here and just this wave of nostalgia as people go, oh, I was at that performance. Oh, I remember that. Oh, did you go and see that? It's a really universal impact as people go through. And when we're talking about that variety of performance, it really is almost bewildering as you're going through it, just the extraordinary scope. The building may have the name, the Sydney Opera House, and that's a prestige title that was chosen for it in the same way that you have the great opera houses around the world, but what they show is a great variety of performance, not just opera or symphonies. You might have rock concerts, you might have exhibitions, you might have films. But if we just look at this wall, for instance, yep, you've got Montserrat Caballé's first performance in Australia, you've got Aida conducting the Sydney Symphony, Musica Viva up and towards top, but then you've also got Don Burrows. Down the bottom, you've got Highway 1, so a surf film, part of a great series of surf films that were shown in the late 70s. Down in the bottom left, The Unseen Utzon, one of the 5 previous exhibitions there have been on the Opera House over the years. They were also exhibitions that concentrated very much on the design of the building and especially on Utzon's primary contribution to the construction and design of the Opera House. The St. Matthew Passion above that, held every Easter, and top left, which is one of our favorites, the Tokyo Shock Boys back from the 1990s, who they performed down in the Playhouse. That's a bit of a reminder to people that the kind of sort of modern burlesque cabaret that we now see featuring in the studio space, or as it was originally built, the recording hall, but it's now referred to as the studio. It's been remodeled. That kind of content has actually been taking place at the Opera House since it first opened. When you're in this space as well, if you want to know a bit more about the posters, like when was their year, because very rarely do these posters actually have the years of the performances, and a lot of them, they don't give the information, well, what's the room it's being shown in. So there's an iPad on both sides, little thumbnails of the various posters, and you can tap on them and it gives you various information. So in this case, it's the big poster for Nabucco, the Barry Kosky production from the 90s, and it will say the Australian Opera. Now we know it as Opera Australia, and it was in the Opera Theatre, which we now know as the Joan Sutherland Theatre. This I thought you'd find quite interesting, because on the left, that's not a photograph. That's the 3D modeled design done by our senior designer, Kieran Larkin, of the design of Gallery 2 in the exhibition. Then on the right, that's actually what it looks like today. So that's the realized design. But this is now how we are doing our designing in full 3D modeling, and it gives you the capacity when you're doing that design to walk through. And so the capacity then for curators to work really closely with the designers is greatly benefited. It's quite extraordinary seeing the results from this 3D modeling. And given the short time frame that we had for this exhibition, because we put this together in, sorry, I've just jumped. There we are. We put this together in a little under a year. So the capacity to do this kind of designing and walkthroughs was an enormous benefit to us. What you may notice in this, people from the Opera House walk in and they all instantly go, oh, it's the JST, it's the Jones Sutherland Theatre. That's what Gallery 2 is arranged to evoke. In this case, it's the seating, the curved seating and the colour scheme with the boxes around the sides. Similarly, on the left, that's not a photograph, that's the 3D model design in an earlier arrangement of the poster room. So the design actually was, the final layout was quite different to that, but that's a 3D modeled version, which if you look really closely, you can see as well, it's our original photographs we took in the reading room, which is why the posters are all at strange angles. It also means, like you can see on the right-hand side, you can do these views from unusual angles to really get an idea about how the space is being arranged. This is then looking the other way, and you can see that where the seating is, you have all the selections of the programs selected from the first year of production. And what we're doing is we're looking down Gallery 2 towards the stage. So when you're there, you'll see that there's even a proscenium arch, there's a thrust stage, and then a whole series of flats going down the side. So it's arranged just like you were looking onto a stage. Section on the right-hand side, there you can see a large photograph of Harold Blair singing. And sharp-eyed as well will spot the Opera House dress by Linda Jackson just over on the left-hand side. She and Jenny Key created their Flamingo Park studio, and they both set out to create clothing that was unmistakably Australian. So Jenny Key, you'll know from her great knitted designs, she really favoured the bold colours and patterns of Australian wildflowers and wildlife. When Linda Jackson created this dress, she looked at the unmistakable profile of the Opera House. And that's a reminder that the second that that building was open, the new unmistakable symbol that meant not just Sydney, but Australia as a whole, was now the form and the shape of the Sydney Opera House. Just from a slightly different view. Then coming into some of the programs that we have on display from the archives collection. And these are from various first nights. And I use that in the plural because there were many, many, many first nights that were held. And the word first keeps getting redefined in all sorts of clever ways over the months. But these are the programs from the gala and the royal opening, so what's otherwise known as the official opening. The gala openings take place on the weekend of the 28th of September, and then the royal openings on the weekend of the 20th of October, a month later. Now, there had been a whole series of performances already taking place for pretty much the past year, but the weekend of the gala openings is when the big companies, so the principal hires, as they were then referred to, like the Australian Opera, the Sydney Symphony, and the Old Tote Theatre Company, they have now moved in, and this is their big first hurrah. So for the opera, it's Prokofiev's War and Peace, which was seen as being a slightly unusual choice, and people are saying, was this an allegory for the construction process of the building? But the enormous cast meant that everybody in the company got to be on stage at some stage for the production. That's the cover of it there. And we've also got some a set and a costume design on display as well. Then you have the Sydney Symphony with Charles McKerris and soprano Birgit Nielsen, who are performing on the next night on the 29th of September. So it was organised agreed that the opera would go first, followed by the Sydney Symphony the following night, and then the Old Tote shortly afterwards. You then get the Cleveland Orchestra, so the first really major international orchestra to then perform. And they're there on October the 2nd. And everyone's keen to see what Lauren Mazel, the conductor, is going to say. What does he think about the Opera House? Then you get the royal concert itself. It's possibly the dullest of all of the programs. It's extremely important for what it represents, but the cover is extremely plain. But it commemorates the opening. What's really important when you open it is that everyone talks about the Beethoven that dominated that performance, and which gave the capacity not just for the Sydney Symphony, but for the Philharmonia choirs to also participate in that evening's performance. But the performance actually began with a short Australian piece. So John Antill's Jubagali, described as a flourish. It was only a short piece of music, but that was a really important recognition right at the beginning of that performance that, of course, the site Bennelong Point has a much, much older history, and that dance and music and performance and ceremony have been taking place there for tens of thousands of years before the construction of the Opera House. So a really important reminder there, and we have the original manuscript score on display as part of the exhibition. Then on the 21st of October, so the day after the royal opening, the Queen actually pays a surprise visit. So there's an official luncheon at Government House on the Sunday. Then she and two of her bodyguard go down through the garden, pop out through the bottom gate, walk across the forecourt and pay a surprise, an unofficial visit to the Opera House, which caused apparently no end of drama with the security at the Opera House when they realized who was walking in the front door quite unofficially. I think it's also a reflection of what you could do back in the 70s. You could certainly never do this now with a surprise visit by a member of the royal family. And I was telling this story, but also that in the cinema that day, there were some kids' movies that were being shown, and suddenly the movie was stopped. The lights went up, all the kids went, "What's going on?" Turned around, and the Queen was standing right behind them. And so they all got to say hello to the Queen. And I was telling this story at a presentation for Opera House staff about 2 months ago. And one of their staff said, "I was there." And she said, "I've never heard this repeated for the past 50 years. So I always thought I'd imagined it." But that's exactly what happened. She was watching the movie. It suddenly stopped. The lights went up. She turned around and the Queen was standing behind her. So there's a fantastic surprise visit that takes place on the Sunday. And if you look in these two photographs, this is her actually on the left, actually leaving, on the right as she was going in from that performance, and she's carrying part of the souvenir program for it. That's it on the left-hand side. You would have seen it in the photographic advertisement for this talk. What's hilarious about it is that it came with a record inside, but the record was a recording of Anna Russell. Now, if you've never heard Anna Russell perform, do yourself a treat and just later on Google Anna Russell and either the Magic Flute or Anna Russell and the Ring Cycle. When Anna was a young woman, she was being trained in opera until she was basically told, "Please stop, you're murdering the music." So instead she went on to a fantastic career creating comic versions and comic lectures explaining these great operas, where she would sing part of it and play, and then she would explain in an extremely funny way what had just been happening. Now, the funny thing about this is that it said, issued with Anna Russell's The Magic Flute, recorded live at the Sydney Opera House. But Anna Russell had not performed at the Sydney Opera House. She was in Sydney at the time, but she'd not performed at the Opera House. So we couldn't work out what this was actually talking about. Then in a chance find, in an article in the Australian Women's Weekly that was actually talking about crochet patterns, and there was an interview as part of that article with Anna Russell, and she said she'd just come from recording a record in the recording hall. So it was the production that she was doing in Sydney at that moment that she then went and redid as a one-off in the recording hall. And that's where they did this recording, and where the record must have been produced incredibly quickly to about a week later to be distributed and given out. So there's the Queen actually holding a copy of this souvenir record. What also starts, and this is a big reminder as well about who performance was for at the Opera House, that it's for everyone. And that was the whole point of the, that was the, every time I bump this, it jumps forward. That it was a great deal of popular entertainment as well. Yes, you've got your operas, you've got your symphonies, you've got your rock concerts, and you've got your light entertainment in this case here, like the series, the Sunday Night at the Opera House series, which are also then broadcast. People like Diane Carroll, the American singer and actress, coming over and performing here. From a later one there that's open, you can see Bert Newton and a very young Olivia Newton-John, and that was her first ever performance at the Opera House. Petula Clark, Harry Seacombe, but also Carol Burnett, so the American comedian, on the 28th of October, so this is the week after the official opening. They film 2 performances in the concert hall, and it's filmed, and shortly afterwards it's screened in the United States. Now, Burnett's ratings were in the millions. So within 2-3 weeks after the opening of the Opera House, millions of people right across the United States were watching a performance from the concert hall. So they're already very aware that there's this extraordinary new building, but now they're actually getting to see what's happening in there. It's available on YouTube. It's a terrible quality reproduction, but you can find it there. And it starts off with them all inside a plane, and they're all clustered at the window, pretending they go, oh, look, I can see it, as they're pretending they're flying over Sydney, and they can look down and see the Opera House. Just like every tourist and every Sydney-sider returning home that flies in over Sydney, you look out the window hoping to catch that glimpse of the harbour, the bridge, and the Opera House. And that Carol Burnett show won an Emmy, and won an Emmy that year for the best outside broadcast. This one's hilarious. So on display, we have the one on the right-hand side, the one for Folk, Festival of Performing Arts. Clifford Atkinson, early in 1973, had actually rung up to book some seats. He wanted to impress his girlfriend, so he was going to take her to the Opera House. And he'd seen this thing, you can now book tickets. So the building's not open yet, but saying you can now book tickets. So he rings up, and he has a very strange conversation with the person at the other end, where he discovers that to book a seat is going to cost something like $10,000. He said, wow, that's expensive. And he's trying to work that out. Then they realize that the person he's speaking to thinks that he's rung up trying to book the entire concert hall for a production. He realized that and goes, just give me a moment, I'll call you back. He then hangs up, calls his friend John Sturzaker and says, I've got this crazy idea. How about we book the concert hall and we'll do a series of performances? And they did, and they were highly successful. There was a night of folk, there was rock, there was jazz, and then like a sort of a best of night as well. But this started Clifford Atkinson's career as a very, very successful and accidental impresario for the next 50 years. A real gem is this program that we have on. This is from March 1974, so it's 6 months after the opening, and it's by the Old Tote Theatre Company. The Old Tote was one of the original principal hirers. It was the drama company that was resident at the Opera House. They fold shortly afterwards, but out of the ashes is then born a very familiar name to everyone in Sydney, which is the Sydney Theatre Company. So this is really the origins of the STC in this company here. This production, though, The Cradle of Hercules by Michael Boddy, is all about the collision of cultures and the clash and the absolute collision of civilizations that takes place. And it centers on the relationship between Bennelong and Governor Phillip. And what's quite notable is that the part of Bennelong is played by a young actor now known to us as Uncle Jack Charles. And the part of Arabanu is played by a young man from the Northern Territory who also does all the choreography and for the dance sequences for the production, and that's David Gulpilil. And when you go to the exhibition, Sylvia Martin, who you can also see there, she plays the part of Mrs. MacArthur. We've got a short oral history that we took with her, and she talks about some of the what was going on backstage with Jack and with David, and it's fantastic. I won't spoil it, but it's fantastic and worth listening to. I mentioned earlier the Linda Jackson dress. What you won't have seen in the background, though, is this wonderful poster for American Airlines. It's also part of the archives collection. This is produced around 1974, and you can see this is produced for Americans who may want to come to Australia. But what now means Australia? It's the shape of the Opera House. Graphically, it's a beautiful poster because the shape of the sails, or the shells, as you will, is then echoed in the shape of the colourful spinnakers of the boats on the harbour. And we've placed that right next to the dress. And on the right-hand side, just a series of other posters that are in this collection as well that are really just highlighting this, that what is Australia now? Australia is the Opera House. What is New South Wales? It's the Opera House. And then on the far right is the poster for the Sydney Opera House Festival that followed for the 2 months after the opening of the Opera House. The main design is from John Coburn's Curtain of the Sun, but then below that is the image of the Opera House itself. I was mentioning that also that the history of the posters and their graphic style, but also some of them are absolute works of art. This is the poster for a production of Cyrano de Bergerac by the STC, starring John Bell, from 1980, but it's a lithograph. So it was actually commissioned by artist David Bromley. It's absolutely exquisite. And you can see from the detail on the right-hand side, you can see all those distinctive lines from the artistic process on the most beautiful of papers. You will not see a poster like that being produced again, I think, I would say, for a very long time. And then the one on the right, which faces it in the exhibition, was produced for the 20th anniversary of the Opera House way back in 1993. Some of us will remember the artist Jeremy, who then for many years went on to be the staff artist for the Sydney Morning Herald, did all of their cartoons. He won this contest and it really launched his career as a professional artist. And he's now based in New York. There's the Nabucco poster again, but what this highlights is the use of posters. So you also, most unlikely, you're ever going to see a poster again of the scale of this Nabucco one. It's from the Barry Kosky production in the 1990s. It's huge. It's by far the biggest poster. It was so big, it was bigger than the plan drawers. It had to be rolled to be placed in there. Next to it is a poster for graphic. So a whole weekend dedicated to graphic art and so graphic comic books, for instance. And you notice the background, there's the Opera House glowing in that city. I've popped it then roughly to scale next to the Nabucco poster. So it's not much bigger than an A4 page. That really is what you now see as a poster. It's an A4 size. It's designed to pop up in maybe a cafe somewhere or to be reproduced on the screen of your phone or on a computer. So poster art has changed radically, especially in the past 10 years, as in many cases, less and less and less posters are actually being produced. On the right, there's the two of those actually sitting side by side. Two other really just quite stunning posters. The one for Scheherazade, magnificent poster from the Sydney Dance Company from 1980 in this wonderful blue, but it also then has squares of gilding, not of actual gold, but of printed gold squares all over that. That just makes it the most gorgeous artwork. Also very unusual that it's in landscape format, one of only two that we came across that were in that format. And on the right, quite appropriate for the new theatre. So this was an exhibition of celebrating 50 years of the new theatre in Sydney, and it's been hand coloured. You can see all the texture marks as they've faded, especially on the 50 down below. It's also got little bits of glitter that have been attached to that. New theatre still in existence, still running up in Newtown. Series of surf posters, and what this one on the left, Highway 1, was chosen to highlight was the changing nature of the interiors of the Opera House. So we talked earlier about the Opera House Cinema, now referred to as the Playhouse and done for smaller dramatic productions. But when it first opened, with the redesign of the interiors of the Opera House that had been done with Peter Hall to the new government specifications after Utzon's departure from the project, it was deemed that this was actually a really appropriate place for screening films. One of the very first sets of films shown there as well was a festival of Indian film that went for 2 weeks, and that was back in 1973. Yirawalla, so one of the great old masters of Northern Territory bark painting. So this is an exhibition. On the left is the poster. It's a very large, very imposing with a sort of wonderful face, and it's quite silvery from the production process. He's staring out into the room. That's from 1975. And what it was a fantastic exhibition of 80 of his bark paintings. Yirawalla features in all the major collections in Australia, especially in the National Gallery. And so just the two I've popped up there are two of his works, and they're quite large as well. It's quite often, it's easy for us to not look at the Opera House in its wider context. And sometimes it's the role it placed in international diplomacy and in politics, and the role that the arts plays in diplomacy and soft diplomacy especially. If you go to Washington, you'll also find a very large collection of Yirawalla's paintings. And the reason is that the National Arts, so the Arts Council for Australia had just been revamped by Whitlam, and the Aboriginal Arts Board had been created back in 1972. And one of the first things they did was start to commission a great series of new works from quite often these quite elderly, but very, very significant old masters of bark paintings in the Northern Territory, and Yirawalla was a key figure for that. The Department of Foreign Affairs in Canberra then bought quite a large number of them and were presenting them as gifts to various foreign nations. And that's how this great collection of Australian bark paintings has ended up in Washington, for instance. And it's been no end of fun as well for us as we've been going through all these posters, looking at how much things used to cost. So entry to this exhibition cost $1 for adults and 20 cents for children and pensioners. We're almost at the end. Now, this one as well is that idea of forgotten histories and what some of these posters and programs tell us about content that really these days has been completely forgotten. In the center is the poster that we have on display, and on the left, the accompanying program, both also from the archives. Now, I remember about, it would have been 10, 15 years ago, watching there was a presentation being done by then Premier Berejiklian from the Opera House, and she was presenting various awards at the Opera House, and she also made reference to someone who was there, who was the first Lebanese performer to perform at the Opera House, which completely forgets this person who is Saba, Jeanette Fagali, but better known as Saba after a character she played in one of her movies. The Lebanese songbird only died relatively recently and had a very, very long career. But when you look at the poster, so her face there, same as from the record on the right-hand side. This was an international tour that followed the release of this record on the right-hand side following the movie Helwe Katir. But you can see in the poster the word Saba up at the top, her face, and then the sort of the cursive, very stylized word in Arabic to the right-hand side. That's all that's actually been printed. So these could have been taken around the world. All the rest is hand calligraphy. So the posters have been brought here as part of the tour, but they can't find anyone who can do poster printing then in Arabic. So someone has been approached who can then do hand calligraphy on all these posters then for display. So it's a fantastic early poster from the collection. It's absolutely one of my favorites. And the final slide, and this is a bit of an indulgence, but it's some of the favorites of all of the staff who've worked on the exhibition. And if you ever really needed to look at some evidence of, well, what goes on in this bewildering array of performance and production at the Opera House, it has to be some of these. So on the left, the Mr. Universe, which was held at the Opera House in 1979 on the concert hall stage. And there's Arnie. So Arnold Schwarzenegger came out. There was great opposition to him taking part because all the local contestants just knew, oh, great. So if Schwarzenegger's there, he's going to win absolutely everything. And he did. But it was also filmed and broadcast around the United States as well. Then from 1974, the Les Girls, I think it was their 20-year spectacular that was held in the concert hall. This one's great fun because normally when you see colossal figures striding over the Opera House, it's like a gigantic space monster or a gigantic robot crushing the Opera House. in the manner of a good old disaster film. Instead, this time it's a colossal Carlotta wrapped in feather boas and ostrich plumes, and she's striding over the podium of the Opera House. So that's in the concert hall in '74. Escapades on Ice, probably it's another program we have on display just because everyone's going to say ice skating. And yes, there was an ice skating rink that was set up on the concert hall stage for ice skating displays. It wasn't actually ice as in frozen water. It was an ice substitute that was used popularly used so you could do displays of skating in, say, shopping centres or in halls, and in this case, the Opera House stage. So yep, there was ice skating after a form on the stage of the concert hall. And on the right, this is, it's not actually, it didn't make it into the exhibition, but this is one of my absolute favorites, because this is my first interaction with the Sydney Opera House. It was a lecture on archaeology and especially Egyptology. And it was held in the Playhouse, then what was then known as the cinema or the music room, but where a whole series of small lectures were given by a man named David Down, and it was a lecture on Egyptology. So somehow my parents let me take myself off on the train into the city. I think I was aged 12, and go into the Opera House. I took myself in there, climbed up the big stairs at the front for the first time, then went downstairs to find out where the Playhouse was, and I went to this lecture myself. So that's my own personal first encounter with the Opera House. Which then brings us to the end of this presentation, which I hope you found enjoyable, but also a bit illuminating as to what happens, what are some of the decisions that take place behind the scenes with these exhibitions, and how we go about making the choices of the objects on display.